hand that around. While we're waiting for that, just to address a couple.
I move that we accept the late item.
It's a PowerPoint, so it's just a copy of a PowerPoint, so we don't need to accept it.
One quick thing that's worth pointing out is that the money generated was through a federal grant, and the terms of that grant are that we use it for pre-approved parking-related activities or return it to the Federal Highway Administration. So we really can't divert it to other uses, unfortunately. Our goal through the parking management program is to provide improved parking services for residents and businesses so people can find parking, have an easier time. We don't want to issue citations. The enforcement activity, is supposed to be just enough to make sure that people are behaving and other people can find parking. The data collection is how we manage, and I'll go through how we are very careful not to collect personal data in that process. I do want to define ALPR, automated license plate readers, what the purpose is. It is essentially a replacement for chalking tires as far as parking enforcement is concerned, and that's important to note because the physical chalking of tires is all day long hitting tires with a stick and causes a lot of shoulder injuries. So one of the things that we anticipate seeing and have already seen with some of the pilot ones is reduction in those injuries, which is great. We don't want to have injured staff. The data collection component is a replacement for walking around with clipboards. So hiring armies of interns or whoever to go out there and record data and manually transcribe it, and then you've got data that's permanently written down somewhere. With the digital version, the data is converted into anonymous information, and then anything that's not needed for an actual parking violation is discarded and deleted. So it actually results in less long-term data on the books than the pencil and paper method. Also saves money. I know the cost is a big concern. If we send out staff, hire consultants, whoever to do this work, there is cost associated with that. So moving on then, the current situation is that we do have 5 of these units that through the Go Berkeley pilot program we purchased, tested, and integrated into our system for both management of parking and for the enforcement. The automated license plate reader technology does provide anonymous data, as I mentioned, for data-driven decisions for parking management. So public works staff will never see a license plate out of this system. We will only see summary tables of how many vehicles are parked here, how long. Gordon and I don't have access to that information of license plates. The police department will need to have the license plates for enforcement as they would. They already take pictures of violations, so that same information would exist whether or not we do this expansion. They, however, only have information about the license plate. In order to convert that to personal identifying information, you have to go to the DMV. And so we have no cross-connection in the system that would link to the DMV and say what person is parked there. So that's, again, not something that's changing, and I think it's important. We're very concerned about the privacy considerations. The police department, before we put in the pilot, adopted careful guidelines on how to manage that and minimize any risk of information getting out, a misuse of information. So we take that seriously. One of the things that is a benefit of the current situation is that it does allow us to cover more area with parking enforcement activities, and if we're going to expand RPP citywide, that's something that's important to us in lieu of having to hire more staff. Another benefit is that parking enforcement officers not only do parking enforcement, but they support PD with a lot of other public services and things that don't necessarily require an officer to go out. Parking enforcement staff can do. So there are community services that are supported through this staffing, and if we occupy less of their time with the parking enforcement activity, it does free up more capacity for those other services. So that's important to us as well. As far as the fiscal impacts, again, this action is specifically to increase the pilot contract from $450,000 to a full implementation at $1.65 million. That's the $1.2 million increase. Normally, we don't go from a small contract to a big one, except that this is a pilot. We tested on small scale, now we're expanding to full scale. And so going from 5 units to 15 units citywide. There's no additional cost for system integration because we already did that. We tested which vendor had the equipment we needed, so we wouldn't go through that process again. And it is funded, as I mentioned, by the Go Berkeley restricted revenues that the Federal Highway Administration has as condition, spend it per their guidelines or give it back to them by 2019. So that is a consideration. So the recommendation really is just to adopt the contract amendment, increasing the contract limit so that we can purchase and implement the 15 additional units. And the benefits are to increase the capacity for delivering parking enforcement at the current levels and future levels if we expand RPP. It supports other services such as pay by phone, and some of the interest that people have in real-time data apps. We could theoretically use this to generate the occupancy and vacancy data that can feed into those apps that you're not going to get by someone walking around with a clipboard. And overall, the intent is to make the parking system work better for our residents in the neighborhoods and for our businesses so that people can find parking and not feel that they can't go shopping in Berkeley because they'll never find a parking space. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Councilor Hahn, you're recognized.
Thank you. And thank you for providing those explanations. As is often the case these past few months as a new council member, these issues, it's first time seeing them. I have a lot of questions about this program. I think that there are some utility arguments that are made that some of which I'm quite sympathetic to and others less so. Certainly the health of our workers I'm very sympathetic to. Super efficient parking enforcement, I'm not sure that we aren't efficient enough at this time. I think with all laws and rules, they sometimes benefit from less than perfect enforcement. I think we all know that's true. Every time someone jaywalks or smokes marijuana in the park or whatever, we have lots of rules and laws that we choose not to enforce at 100%, and we actually think that has some social utility. So I'm unclear about what the specific gap is that we're trying to close here and why it's so important for us to close it. So I also think that if we think we need, first of all, a break for people's arms, there are ways that one can manage around that with shorter shifts, with changing different tasks throughout a day or over weeks. I mean, there are many, many industries where you have repetitive motion that can cause stress to a limb, and there are tried and true methodologies for reducing that, and I certainly think that we should be maximizing those. So I see, some utility arguments here, but I don't find them compelling. On the other side, I see really high costs in terms of privacy. It is true that license plates are available for the public to consume, but never in history, even with the police going around Carnegie Hall, which is a story I didn't know. But really, never in history have we had the capacity to vacuum up this kind of data. And this changes things. I think that we need, not just in this instance, but on many of these issues, I think we need to realize that the quantity and volume of information that we are able now to capture about people is just accelerated, and the ability to pass that information along and for it to be used and misused it's just something that we've never seen before, and for me it changes things. And so I looked at the guidelines, the administrative order, and I think it's very leaky. I mean, there's some attempt to put a little bit of language in here, but, you know, it can be used for official and legitimate law enforcement purposes. Probable cause is not required, nor reasonable suspicion. The city manager is authorized to allow this data to be used for some other purposes, but there's no guidelines for how she would use that power. At the same time, we also have the Police Review Commission that's working on a surveillance ordinance. We have a council subcommittee that's going to be working on NICRIC. And so I really think that the marginal utility, the fact that we probably could achieve some of these goals otherwise, other uses for these funds, which we could look at, and on the other side, from myself, the really serious questions about how this data might be used. I'm not saying that you're anticipating it now or that it's your plan or that there aren't some safeguards, but for me, it's not adequate for the environment that we're in right now. I did have a short conversation with Phil Harrington today, and it certainly wasn't long enough to have a full hearing of these things. But you know, he mentioned that I asked him what specific problem are we trying to solve, and he mentioned, well, in the residential permit areas, we have people who stay for 2 hours, then they come back and they get chalked, and maybe they take the chalk off their tire and they park somewhere else, and then they park somewhere else. And I asked him, well, who do you think those people are? Well, this often your BART stations. Well, if you're commuting, then you're probably not coming back every 2 hours to move your car. I think that the people who are doing this are employees who are coming to work. And I see that in my district, that employees will come to work, they have to park near, or they consider that they have to park near their workplace. So they're commuters in a different way. And they leave work every 2 hours to move their car. That seems like a real problem to me that we should solve, but I don't think we should solve it by giving them tickets. I think we need to solve it by giving them transit passes, by working with employers to have plans for their employees, et cetera. So I have a lot of questions about it. I have a lot of concerns. I don't think I'm going to be able to support it today. I think I might be able to support it later with a lot more analysis and a lot more policies in place.
Thank you. So before I call on Councilor Worthington, so we've had a Go Berkeley program, which has been in effect for a number of years now, and we did implement this technology as a way to ensure that people weren't parking and exceeding the time limits, and it's made Go Berkeley more effective. And the goal of Go Berkeley is to increase parking capacity, particularly in the downtown and Telegraph and College Avenue area. And also we're looking at potentially expanding this to the residential preferential parking zones, although I do think we need to let people know about the block face rule when we do that. Having lived in an RPP zone, and those council members that live in an RPP zone, parking is really difficult. I live right adjacent to North Shattuck, and so does Councilor Harrison, and I'll be lucky to find a parking space on my block. And so we want to make sure that residents who live in the RPP zones can actually be able to park in their neighborhood. And this is one tool that we can use to do that, in addition to implementing the Go Berkeley program, which benefits business owners and benefits the environment and the citizens of Berkeley as a whole. Councilor Worthington.
Thank you, Mayor Arreguín. Well, you took away my number one reason that I was going to say. I enthusiastically agree with you. But I think there are so many other reasons why the city manager's recommendation is really a very wise and thoughtful proposal. First and foremost, whatever our concerns about fiscal responsibility, this small investment will have long-term benefits in terms of reducing or preventing increases to salaries and pensions for multiple employees who will have to do all this work in a very laborious way. It will reduce workers' comp claims, I believe, because of improved conditions for the workers' health. It will increase revenue, but that's not on my list of priorities. You're right, but it's not one of my reasons to be gung-ho to do this. So first, it's a major issue of fiscal responsibility. It's an issue of using technology in smart ways to serve the people. It's consistent with other technologies that we're trying to introduce to improve consumer quality of life. This is consistent with our pay-by-phone proposals that have been in the works for a long time. So it's allowing that technology and this technology to work together to serve the consumer in a better way. And most importantly of all, the concerns about surveillance. For those people who are not aware, I'm very aware because I wrote the proposal for the city of Berkeley to have a very, very, very strong surveillance policy, perhaps the strongest in the United States. We are working very hard. I'm working on it as a council member. We have 4 members of the Police Review Commission who are working on it. We have at least 3 departments that I know of, and maybe more, working on it. Oh, and the city attorney. So 4 departments working on it. We are going to have a great surveillance policy. We have a great city council. I'm confident we'll have a great surveillance policy. So I don't think there's any reason to think that this is going to be used in nefarious ways. So I would like to move that we adopt the city manager's recommendation. Thank you.
Okay. Moved and seconded. Councilmember Davil.
Yes, I'd like to thank Councilmember Harrison for her research and eloquent statements, which I agree with, and also the public comments on equity and surveillance and privacy protections. We are in a different state right now with the DTs in the White House, so the surveillance issue is very critical to me, and yeah, we'll have a policy, but I don't believe that. I just question the DT, so we don't know what that will look like, and I just feel like we don't want to, be part of any type of surveillance. It's just too much right now, I think, with this, what's going on in the country. So I can't support this either at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Harrison.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of split the 2 issues from each other. I feel differently about the demand management side of this and the fact that people will be able to pay by phone and the reasonable parking enforcement. If we have unreasonable parking enforcement, we should be dealing with that by changing our policies, such as referenced by Jonathan about the 3-day rule, which hits me quite frequently, I have to say. And so I would rather see us address that through policy changes rather than not enforcing the laws that we have. My focus is on the data retention piece of this and the aggregated data. I'm wondering, first of all, is there any way in order to move forward with this without the reference to providing this data via NCRIC and impending the establishment of the finalization of the surveillance policy? I'd like to see us use it for our own traffic purposes, but we have a retention of data for 365 days here. Aggregated data, we have the city manager able to pass on aggregated data, and she and I have spoken about making sure that's within council direction and policy, but we don't have that policy yet, so I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know if there's any way to do this with just the parking piece and not have the retention of the data and the passage of the data through NCRIC and other purposes.
Yeah, and Randy Files may have something to add here, but I do want to say the 365-day retention is only for parking violations. So if we issue a citation, we have to retain a record of the citation long enough for someone to contest it and go through the process, and then we discard it. So that's information that exists today without ALPR. The rest of the data is gone after 30 days. The aggregated data is already stripped of any license plate numbers. It really is just a number of occupied spaces, number of vacant spaces, and frequency of turnover. So there's no way to back trace from that to come to any sort of personal identifying information. So the piece that remains is kind of that 30-day while we're processing and creating the anonymous reports. That's the only time that the data exists, and we would look to scrap that as soon as possible. I don't know, Randy, if you want to add anything on that?
You've added everything that I would have said, except that we don't report this data to NCRIC. This is a very Berkeley-centric program. It only works within Berkeley. This data is not going elsewhere.
We have yet to finalize our surveillance policy, and we do have this ongoing discussion about our involvement with NCRIC. This policy itself directly references NCRIC in it, and so I'm not confident about that. And I guess can I just ask a base question first of all, and that is it says collected images and metadata will not be stored for more than 365 days. What do you mean by metadata?
That would be the information about the GIS tagging. So we need to know which block was this on, what parking space was it in order to do the enforcement activity or the data. I mean, for us, the parking management data, we need to know which block had what occupancy. So that's kind of what the metadata is about, time and place.
Okay.
But yeah, beyond that, there's nothing else.
So that's helping with the demand management piece as well?
Correct.
Looking at parking patterns?
Right now, part of the Go Berkeley policy is that in locations that are over 85% occupied, we consider that too highly occupied, and we want to do something to increase the capacity there. And so we make changes. If there's a location that's below 65% occupied, we figure the parking pricing is too high. Let's lower the prices, incentivize more people to park there and not in the higher demand zones. So that's the kind of data that we're getting at that allows us to manage the parking occupancy throughout the city.
So I guess my question really is for the city manager and city attorney about how we can address the other concerns that I have.
So can you repeat the final concerns that you have? Because
Yeah.
I'm not certain that I understand where
Page
you've left
3 of the
us.
policy, paragraph F says aggregated ALPR data not related to specific investigations shall not be released to any local, state, or federal agency without the express written consent of the city manager. It does not reference the surveillance policy. It does not reference city council policy.
And as you and I spoke about, there was certainly a willingness to add on pursuant to adopted policies by the council, which would entail the surveillance policy, and certainly the implementation of this. And I'll defer to the staff to kind of let me know if there are urgency issues. But we can certainly defer implementation further until a policy is adopted to address your concerns. But we've talked about specifically adding in a sentence to address that.
Yeah. I would ask that we defer on that basis. But I don't know if you can go ahead with the parking management piece and not the other piece. If there's some way I'm trying to get this severed, these two issues.
Have to defer that to the staff.
How long will it take for this to be actually implemented? I mean,
So
I don't want to defer on everything, sorry.
yeah, you're next in the queue. Councilor Harrison, you still have the floor. So if I can just
Please.
restate that question. So what would be, if we approve this item tonight, how long will it take for us to purchase units and actually deploy them in the field?
That's something Gordon probably answers best.
Sure. So we'll need to go through the contract amendment process with the vendor. We are looking at possibly 2 to 3 months from that point until installation and full testing and acceptance, perhaps a bit longer.
So, Madam City, what's the timeline? Do you know when a surveillance ordinance may come to us?
So that there's no time, I have no time frame for that. But I think for F, if F is the actual area where we need to put some language and still move forward, this has never been done. There has never been a release of data at any time, and I think it's important to recognize that, but also to state that none would be released until such time that council or under policy as established.
That's good.
I'm willing to put in the necessary restrictions that you need to implement this program, but this has never been done before, and there's no intent to do so in the future.
I appreciate that.
So, Madam, just on that, if I may, Councilor Miles, before I call on you. So so this is an administrative policy that the department implemented around the use of this technology. And so it would be, I guess, an administrative change to policy But what I heard you say, Madam City Manager, is that you would support amending the policy to say that the data will not be, I guess, released or used for law enforcement purposes, I guess, other than the purposes necessary for parking enforcement
Administration.
until such time as a surveillance policy is in effect. I'm just trying to get clarification on what.
Specifically for page 3, section F, and going
Policy.
just of the, yes, this is of the administrative order. Going to the sentence at the very end to add on to this clause a statement regarding deferring until such time surveillance policy has been implemented.
Okay, so here we go.
That's probably not.
Yes, that works fine.
So,
Yeah,
what would be the
here it is.
practical effect of that for your purposes, Mr. Jovindal?
I think that, again, as long as the data is not being released out of the system, it still allows us to extract the summary data that we need for parking management. So I don't see a real issue there. As the city manager said, this is not data that has ever been released in the past, and the existing system operates fine. So as it stands, I see no problem with making that amendment to F on page 3 to say that, yeah, nothing will be released until the surveillance policy is complete, and if it ends up allowing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam City Manager, for considering that amendment. Councilor Maya.
Good, well, that's put to bed then. I wanted to ask you a question before I go into my specific reasons why I think this is important. Currently, Berkeley residents, whether they're in an RPP area or not, go away on vacation and leave their car on the street for a week or maybe 2. And the way it works now is nothing really much happens unless somebody makes a complaint. And that won't change. I mean, will there be any gathering of data regarding how long a car is placed on the street?
There's no intent to change the enforcement policy. So the 72-hour limit, the block face parking policy, those are things that we would not change without further consultation with council. If we determine over time that there's a substantial problem associated with it, we can have a discussion there. But just because the capacity exists does not mean that we would change the enforcement policy.
Right, so will those license plates be read?
The license plates will be read. As we said, the system will take up to 30 days to convert that data into the summary reports that extract all of the identifying information. So conceptually, it would be possible to do enforcement on the 72-hour basis. But again, as people have become used to things like, parking across their driveways without us enforcing that, which could be enforced on site, we're not planning to change those policies at all at the time.
So I guess what I didn't realize was that every license plate on the block will be read. Is that correct?
Right, all the license plates will be read, and again, this is something that will support the
Yeah, I get
the residential shared parking
the
pilot
administration
as well.
and the planning and et cetera.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in concept, you could go to a stickerless RPP permit system where you don't have to put a sticker on your car, you just
Wow.
register your license
That
plate.
would be interesting. So I did want to say the reason that I think this is important, and I'll give an example. We have people in many neighborhoods now, in RPP neighborhoods, who move their cars around. And we have a particularly critical situation because the university opened an administrative office on 4th and Virginia. And they have a parking lot. But the employees would rather park in the neighborhood than pay for parking in the parking lot. So suddenly, all of the neighbors who had access, who had no driveways to parking, have no access to parking anymore. They can't go out and get groceries and come back and expect to be able to park there, or have a baby in the car and have to carry all of that. So they're waiting for RPP to happen there because we've been pushing it forward now because they really need it. And once that happens, the enforcement will determine whether or not people will either take public transit to their job instead of warehousing their car on the street all day, or pay for parking, which was what the university designed. We only have a certain number of parking enforcement staff, and we have to use them efficiently. And this will enable us to do that, and actually move toward what we have always wanted to do, which is to help people make alternative choices than just driving and taking the easy way out and parking in the neighborhood. So I'm pleased that we're going through with this. I'm really glad that the surveillance language got worked out, and I plan to support the item.
Thank you. Councilmember Bartlett.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, Councilmember Harrison, for raising your points about the NCRIC involvement. And that's why I voted against NCRIC, too, because I do think that Americans need a break from the state, need a little bit of space. And also, I think they need a little bit of space from regressive taxation and these fines and these fees. Homeowners are going to have garages and driveways and be unaffected by this blanketing of mapping of license plates. Whereas apartment dwellers, people who have to work, who are less than a paycheck away from losing their apartment, et cetera, victims of the housing crisis, just living check to check, all those people that I'm here to protect, they're the ones who suffer from tickets. It's about tickets, right? And who gets tickets? And when you get a ticket, what happens to you? And I definitely have tell you some horror stories about people getting tickets, and you can't make it to court because you got to work, and you got to get your baby here, and then your ticket doubles, and it doubles again, and next thing you know, you're Ferguson. So I'm definitely not going to support this because I do not believe in blanketing people with excessive fines.
Thank you. Councilmember Drosten.
Yes, thank you. So I was jotting down notes as you were giving your presentation, and I just want to make sure I have this all correct. So you're saying that we can't divert this funding to other uses. There's less data on the books with this particular method. It saves money and staff time. Police have the same information whether or not we use this system. It allows staff to cover more areas. Interestingly, we use this money or we give it back to the federal government.
Correct.
So we're giving it back. That's a little scary in itself. And it's interesting that Go Berkeley is such a widely lauded program, and the way we are able to manage parking. And I have to say that, like Councilmember Mayo mentioned, residents around Alta Bates have been begging for LPRs for quite some time because you have a lot of workers parking in the neighborhoods. But also I want to talk about how this is helpful to the environment and the disproportionate impacts when we have increased GHGs on poor communities, if we look at asthma rates. And this reduces circling and traffic congestion and GHGs. And we know that wealthier people tend to use cars, so I think anything that we can do to encourage more of a green style of living and address some of these parking impacts and this reliance on auto-centric, oil-fueled culture, I think is a good thing to do. And of course, I want to support Go Berkeley. It's been so wildly successful, and we've received so much praise for it. And I want to be able to help provide you with that information that I think makes the program great. Thank you.
Thank you. So everyone, with the exception of Councilor Wangraff, has spoken on this item. So those councilors I'm going to recognize.
I seconded the motion.
Okay, so I guess everyone has spoken. Everyone's already had one chance to speak. Those councilors that are requesting recognition again, I just want to ask if we can keep our comments brief because we have a lot of other items to get to tonight. Councilor Hahn.
Thank you. I just want to say that I'm sensitive to the concerns of certain areas, concentrated areas, West Berkeley, where there's a new UC facility, Alta Bates, BART station areas. But what that suggests to me is that we should have a very tailored and targeted program. We already have 5 of these. So I think, I'd prefer quite frankly, not sure I would support having any, but that may be because I have a lot less information about this program. The report probably didn't have as much as council members had when this program was first put in place. But I think that we can do a smart deployment of what we already have and not spend $1.5 million on this. I also just want to talk about the idea of the choice of being irresponsible by driving a car. I talk to merchants, and a lot of them cannot get employees at minimum wage or close to minimum wage. People are driving here from Brentwood to have minimum wage jobs. I wish they didn't have to drive, but they drive here and then they drive to their next job. And they don't really have let's call it sometimes the luxury of BART and 3 buses and whatever else. And so to Council Member Bartlett's comments about how this is regressive, I really do think all of this, while I appreciate the sort of data-driven, smart aspects of it, we really need to be looking at what are the impacts of these kinds of policies on poor people and working people and people who don't have the luxury of time. And so, yeah, I would have loved to have a lot more data on this. It's possible that with a much more in-depth analysis of the specific reasons why we need this and why is this the best thing since sliced bread, and more holes plugged because there's still lots of holes in this policy, I might have been able to support it. But as it is in front of me today and with the information I have, I'm not going to be able to.
So I just want to make one quick comment, which is that we're not in the business of going out and trying to find people intentionally. The reason we find people is because they violate our parking rules. And the reason we have rules regarding how long people can park is that residents and visitors to commercial districts and residential districts can find a place to park. And so I think it's important to just keep in mind we don't have this whole process in place just to get revenue. These citations are because people park too long, because we want to increase turnover so that residents and visitors can park in our city. And I think it's particularly important that residents who live particularly in areas that are very impacted, such as around the University of California and commercial districts, that they have parking available, because not every person has a driveway and they do park on the street. I do think we need to look at changes to the RPP program, such as not allowing people to have multiple permits per household. I think that would go a long way towards addressing our climate goals. That's a whole nother issue that's not our agenda tonight, but I just think it's important to put this in context that we find people because they violate our parking rules, which are designed to increase parking availability for residents and visitors in our city, which benefits businesses and benefits residents. Councilmember Davila.
It's great that we have these big employers, but they don't provide parking for their employees, and unfortunately people have to park and move their cars, and then they get fines. So maybe we should come up with a employee parking permit so that they can park there and not have to move their cars. Just saying. But yeah, everybody can't live in Berkeley. They can't afford to live in Berkeley, so some people have to be here. Councilmember Harrison just stated this, how people live all over all different counties just to come to Berkeley to work. And they need their car. They might have to go to another job. They might have to go pick up their children. So I think we should figure out a way to do this without surveillance and NICRIC. And I'm wondering, is a federal grant from UASI, or who's the federal grant from?
From the Federal Highway Administration.
Okay, that's right, you did say that. Thank you.
Councilmember Worthington.
Well, I think we all say that we care about the environment, and to reject this money and this program would be a serious setback to our environmental program like Go Berkeley. Instead of undermining it and shooting ourselves in the foot, I'd like to see us expand it dramatically. It's a powerful tool for greenhouse gas reductions, and we shouldn't undermine it by taking away the technological tools that allow it to actually be effective. And, if we care about our workers who work for the city, this is really good for their health. If we care about the taxpayers, it's really good for their the fiscal responsibility. And with Councilmember Harrison's amendment on surveillance, I think we already had assurances that this is going to it's never been released, it's not planned to be released, it's not going to be released, but now it can't be released. Even if somebody wants to, they can't give it until we get our surveillance policy. And I predict once we get our surveillance policy, it still will not be released to anybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Harrison.
I just want to
Markey, we
address.
had public comment.
I just want to address the equity issue really briefly. In my district, I own a home, so I have a driveway. The people that live in my district that cannot park, who are residents, are apartment dwellers. They are the people that have less money. So I think we're looking at two different equities, the equity of people that drive into town, but also in the RPP district, the equity of people that are residents there that need a place to put their car, and the only place to put it is on the street. When people violate the RPP, those people have nowhere to park. They have families, they bring groceries home, they go to jobs and come back. They need to be able to park. So I don't want to make it sound like all the equity arguments are on one side. I think they cut both ways. Thank you.
Okay. Let's call the roll on the main motion, because I don't think there's a substitute motion.
Nope. To adopt the city manager's recommendation with the amendment to Part 7F of the administrative policy. Councilmember Mayo?
Yes.
Davila?
No.
Bartlett?
No.
Harrison?
Yes.
Hahn?
No.
Wengraf? Worthington?
Yes.
Drosty?
Yes.
Mayor Arreguín?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. So let's move to item 18, and hopefully this won't take that long. This is Ending Tax Breaks for Private Prisons Act. This is a